Something so small, so seemingly inconsequential, that I still struggle to believe it unraveled everything. I was standing in the living room folding laundry when Jake called out from the hallway. "Lorraine, can you give me a hand with this?" I turned to see him standing by the stairs, his hands fumbling with the buckle of his belt. He was wearing a pair of khaki shorts that hung loosely on his hips, the leather strap of the belt twisted awkwardly. "Can you fix this? It's stuck or something?" he said, walking toward me. "Sure," I said, setting the folded towels aside. I stepped closer, reaching for the belt, and tried to untangle the strap from the buckle. "Hold still," I said, concentrating. "Yeah, sorry," he replied, holding his breath as I worked. But as I tugged at the leather, the buckle gave way, and before either of us could react, his shorts slipped down to his ankles. The world seemed to freeze. My eyes flickered downward, just for a second, a reflex I couldn't control, and I saw everything before quickly looking away. Jake stood frozen, his hands hovering awkwardly, his face turning red. Sorry," he muttered, quickly pulling his shorts back up. I stepped back, my cheeks burning as I stammered. "It's fine. It happens." "Yeah," he said, his voice strained. "Thanks, for the help." He turned and hurried upstairs, leaving me standing there, my heart racing and my thoughts swirling. It was just an accident, a fleeting moment of awkwardness. But the charged air in the room, the way his eyes lingered on mine before he walked away, it changed something. Neither of us spoke about it, but from that moment on, things between us were never the same. My marriage to Alan wasn't what you'd call a love story. It wasn't bad either. Just a quiet, comfortable arrangement that had been losing its warmth for years. We married when I was 44, and he was 50. Both of us coming off failed first marriages. Alan was a man of routines and hobbies. Golf on Saturdays, fishing trips once a month, and an endless rotation of client dinners that kept him out late more often than not. I had come to accept the silences between us as part of the deal, filling my days with charity work, gardening, and keeping the house in order. But then Jake moved in. Alan's son from his first marriage had always been polite and distant with me. I'd only seen him a handful of times in the early years of my marriage, during the obligatory holiday visits when he was still in college. He was reserved back then, awkward in the way young men are when forced into rooms with new stepmothers. But now, 6 years later, the man who showed up at our doorstep wasn't the shy teenager I remembered. Jake had recently graduated and was struggling to find his footing in the world. His degree in fine arts, something Alan still rolled his eyes about, hadn't led to immediate success, and Alan offered him a place to stay while he figured things out. I wasn't consulted on the matter, but I didn't object. The house was big enough to accommodate him, and I didn't mind the idea of some company during the long days when Alan was at work or out with friends. What I didn't expect was how quickly Jake's presence would shift the energy of the house. He had an ease about him, the kind of natural charm that made people want to be around him. His humor was dry but disarming, his smile infectious, and his presence filled the empty spaces of the house in a way that Alan's never did. It started with small moments. One morning, I was trimming the hedges in the backyard when Jake wandered out with a cup of coffee, barefoot and tousled from sleep. He leaned against the patio door, watching me work with a lazy grin. "You're up early," I remarked, glancing at him. He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Couldn't sleep. Besides, someone has to admire all the work you're putting in out here." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Don't let Alan hear you say that. He thinks this garden just takes care of itself." "Alan doesn't notice much," Jake replied, his tone casual but pointed. The comment caught me off guard, but I didn't press him on it. Instead, I kept trimming, acutely aware of his gaze lingering on me. Over the weeks, our conversations grew longer, and our interactions became a steady rhythm in the house. Jake would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, telling me stories about his college days or asking for advice about job applications. One afternoon, I found him sprawled on the couch in the living room, sketching in a notebook. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked, nodding toward the pad. He hesitated for a moment before handing it over. The pages were filled with intricate pencil sketches, portraits, landscapes, abstract designs that felt alive with movement. "These are incredible," I said honestly. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet. It's just something I do to pass the time. You should show these to someone, I said. A gallery or an art director. You have real talent, Jake. He smiled faintly, his eyes meeting mine. You're the first person who's ever said that. The weight of his words hung between us, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Then came the belt incident, and everything changed. For days after, the air between us felt charged, heavy with an unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to address. I avoided being alone with him whenever possible, but it was a futile effort. The house was too quiet, too full of moments where we inevitably crossed paths. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, Jake came into the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower. "Lorraine," he said, his voice soft. I turned, my heart racing at the way he said my name. "Yes?" He hesitated, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "About the other day, I'm sorry, that was awkward." "It's fine," I said quickly, turning back to the sink. "Let's just forget about it." "I don't think I can," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. Slowly I turned to face him, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "Jake, we can't," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "I know. I don't want you to think it didn't mean anything to me." The intensity in his voice left me speechless, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then Alan's voice called out from the front door, breaking the spell. "I'll be right there," I said quickly, turning away from Jake. But even as I walked away, I knew something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. Alan, oblivious as ever, spent his evenings glued to the television or out with friends, leaving Jake and me to navigate the minefield we had created. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the guest room, Jake appeared in the doorway. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative. I hesitated before nodding. "Close the door." He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "I don't know how to act around you anymore," he admitted, his voice raw. "Jake, we have to let this go," I said, my voice trembling. "It was a moment, nothing more." "But it wasn't just a moment," he said, stepping closer. "At least, not for me." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I let myself acknowledge the truth. It wasn't just a moment for me either. There's a moment when you know you're about to cross a line, and that once you do, there's no going back. I knew it the first time Jake kissed me. It wasn't planned, none of this ever was. It happened late one evening, after Alan had gone out to one of his golf buddies' poker nights. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when Jake walked in. "Can't sleep?" I asked, glancing at him. "Something like that," he said, leaning against the doorway. He was barefoot, his hair messy, and there was a tension in his posture that made my chest tighten. We stood there in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, the intensity in his gaze left me breathless. "Lorraine," he said softly, taking a step closer. "Jake, don't," I whispered, even as my pulse quickened. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have to," I replied, my voice trembling. "This is wrong. You know that." "I know," he said, closing the distance between us. "But that doesn't change how I feel." And then he kissed me. It was tentative at first, as though he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When I finally pulled back, my heart was racing and I could barely meet his eyes. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. Neither did I. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and quiet desperation. We tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch felt electric, charged with the weight of everything we weren't saying. Alan remained blissfully unaware, his attention divided between work, his friends, and his endless hobbies. But even as he remained distracted, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing with fire. The second time it happened, it was in the garden. I had spent the morning pruning the roses, the warm sun beating down on my back, when Jake appeared behind me. "You're always out here," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. "It's peaceful," I replied, not turning around. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "I think you like avoiding me." My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. I turned to face him, my chest tightening as I met his gaze. There was no hesitation this time, no chance to talk myself out of it. He kissed me again, and this time, I kissed him back. What began as fleeting moments quickly spiraled into something neither of us could control. We were careful at first, finding quiet corners of the house where we wouldn't be disturbed. But the more time we spent together, the bolder we became. One evening, while Alan was out at a client dinner, Jake and I found ourselves in the library. I was pretending to organize the shelves, my hands trembling as he stood behind me. "You're shaking," he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed me. He placed his hands on my shoulders, turning me to face him. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered. "I'm afraid of what we're doing." He cupped my face in his hands, his gaze steady. "Then stop thinking about it. Just be with me." I wanted to argue, to tell him we couldn't keep doing this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let him pull me into his arms, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. The secrecy of our relationship only added to its intensity. Every stolen moment felt like a rebellion against the life I had settled for, a reminder that there was still passion and desire buried beneath the routine of my marriage. But with the thrill came the fear. One afternoon, as Jake and I sat on the couch in the living room, Alan came home earlier than expected. "Lorraine?" he called out from the hallway. I jumped up, my heart racing as Jake quickly moved to the opposite side of the room. "In here," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. Alan walked in, glancing between us. "Didn't realize you'd have company," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes lingering on Jake. "Just catching up," Jake said smoothly, his posture relaxed. Alan nodded, but the look he gave me as he walked away sent a shiver down my spine. As careful as we were, it became harder to hide. Alan began asking questions. Subtle at first, but increasingly pointed. "You and Jake seem to be getting along well," he remarked one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "He's been a big help around the house," I replied, forcing a smile. Alan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad to see that. It's good to know someone's keeping you company while I'm busy." His words were laced with something I couldn't quite place, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The first real crack came when Jake's best friend, Grant, showed up unannounced. Grant was loud, opinionated, and had a knack for picking up on things others tried to hide. "You've been spending a lot of time at home," Grant said to Jake one afternoon, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Just helping out," Jake replied casually. "Must be nice," Grant said, his gaze flicking to me. "Having someone to keep you company." The comment sent a chill through me, and I quickly excused myself, leaving the two of them alone. Later, Jake found me in the kitchen, his expression tense. "Grant knows something," he said quietly. "He's guessing," I replied, though my voice wavered. Jake shook his head. "He's not stupid, Lorraine. He's going to figure it out." As the weeks went on, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Alan's suspicions, Grant's remarks, the weight of our secret. It all felt like a storm waiting to break. But even as the risks grew, so did my feelings for Jake. And no matter how dangerous it became, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. Keeping a secret is like holding your breath underwater. You can only do it for so long before the pressure starts to crush you. Jake and I were good at hiding, but the cracks in our facade were growing wider. Alan wasn't stupid, and neither was Grant. And then there was Heather, Alan's colleague, who managed to turn her casual visits into something more intrusive with each passing week. Heather arrived one Saturday afternoon, uninvited but perfectly at ease. She had been to the house a few times before, always under the pretense of dropping something off for Alan. This time, she came with a bottle of wine and a too-bright smile. "I thought I'd stop by," she said as she walked into the kitchen where I was chopping vegetables. "Alan mentioned you've been feeling a little overwhelmed lately. I figured you could use a distraction." "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile, "but thank you." Heather placed the bottle on the counter and leaned against the island, her eyes scanning the room like she was cataloging every detail. "This place is gorgeous. You've done such a good job making it feel like a home." "Thank you," I said tightly. Her gaze lingered on the back door, where Jake had walked out only moments before. "Alan's lucky to have you, and Jake, of course. He's such a big help around here, isn't he?" My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "He's been great. It's nice having him around." Heather's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I bet it is." As the weeks went on, Heather's presence became more frequent. She found excuses to drop by, always under the guise of work, but her real purpose was clear. She was fishing for something, though I couldn't tell if it was information or Alan himself. "You know," she said one afternoon as we sat in the living room, "Alan doesn't talk much about his personal life. But I get the sense that things haven't been perfect between you two." I stiffened, my hands gripping the teacup in my lap. "Every marriage has its challenges." "Of course," Heather said, her tone laced with false sympathy. "But I'm sure it helps having Jake around. He seems attentive." The implication in her words was unmistakable, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. Then there was Grant. Jake's best friend had always been blunt to the point of rudeness, but now his comments carried a sharper edge. "You've been spending a lot of time with Lorraine," Grant said one evening as he and Jake sat on the patio, beers in hand. Jake shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "She's my stepmom. Of course, we're going to talk." "Yeah, but it's not just that, is it?" Grant pressed, his gaze piercing. Jake's grip on his bottle tightened. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying you're acting weird," Grant replied. "And I don't think it's just because of the job stuff. There's something else going on, and I think it involves her." Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone. "You don't know what you're talking about." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Don't I?" The tension in the house grew unbearable. Every interaction with Alan felt like walking a tightrope, every visit from Heather like a test I was destined to fail. And Jake? Jake was becoming bolder, his frustration with our secrecy bubbling to the surface. One evening, as we sat in the library, he turned to me, his expression hard. "I can't keep doing this," he said. "Jake, we have to be careful," I replied, my voice trembling. "Careful isn't enough," he shot back. "Grant's suspicious, Heather's sniffing around, and Alan's not as clueless as you think." I looked away, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "What are you suggesting? That we stop?" He moved closer, his voice softening. "You know I can't do that, but we need to figure out what we're gonna do, because this isn't sustainable." The breaking point came during a dinner party Alan insisted on hosting. Heather was there, of course, along with a few of Alan's colleagues. Grant showed up too, his invitation courtesy of Jake. The evening started out innocently enough, polite conversation, laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, but as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. "So, Lorraine," Heather said, her voice cutting through the chatter, "how do you keep yourself occupied with Alan gone so often?" I froze, her question dripping with implication. "The usual things," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Gardening, reading, helping Jake with a few projects." Heather's smile sharpened. "You must be very close then." Across the table, Grant raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to Jake. "Yeah, Jake's been spending a lot of time here lately. I guess it makes sense. Lorraine's pretty easy to talk to." The table fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Alan looked between us, his expression unreadable, while Heather sipped her wine, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Jake pushed back his chair abruptly. "Excuse me," he muttered, leaving the room. "I think I'll check on him," I said quickly, standing up before anyone could stop me. I found Jake in the garden, pacing under the soft glow of the patio lights. "This was a mistake," he said as I approached. "What was?" I asked, my heart pounding. "All of it," he replied, his voice tight with frustration. "Letting Grant come here, pretending like everything's fine." "It's not fine, Lorraine. It's falling apart." I reached for him, my hand brushing his arm. "We'll figure it out." He turned to me, his eyes filled with desperation. "How?" "Because I'm running out of ways to keep this together." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps on the gravel made us both freeze. I turned to see Alan standing at the edge of the garden, his face shadowed but his posture rigid. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Alan stood at the edge of the garden, his figure rigid in the soft glow of the patio lights. I could feel Jake tense beside me, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, and my mind raced for something to say, anything to diffuse the tension that hung heavy in the air. Alan, I said, forcing a smile. We were just talking, he interrupted, his voice sharp. He took a step forward, his gaze flicking between me and Jake. Funny how the two of you seem to have so much to talk about these days. Jake straightened, his jaw tightening. Is there a problem? Alan's lips curled into a cold smile. I don't know, Jake. Should there be? The weight of his words hit like a punch to the gut, and I felt my breath catch. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. He knew. I think I'll head inside, Jake said, his voice steady but strained. No, Alan snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. You'll stay right here. Jake hesitated, but he didn't move. Alan turned his attention to me, his eyes dark. Care to explain why my wife and my son are sneaking around in the garden during a dinner party? I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The tension boiled over the next day. Alan was colder than ever, his clipped tone and icy stares making it clear that he wasn't letting this go. Jake tried to keep his distance, but it only made things worse. Heather, of course, found a way to insert herself into the chaos. I couldn't help but notice the awkwardness last night, she said as she sipped her coffee in the kitchen. It was just a misunderstanding, I replied, trying to keep my voice light. Heather tilted her head, her smile too sweet to be genuine. Of course. But, Lorraine, you might want to be careful. Perceptions can be dangerous, especially in a situation like this. Her words were a veiled threat, and I knew she was enjoying every second of it. The real twist came later that evening. Alan called me into the study, his demeanor calm but unnerving. I've been thinking, he said as he leaned back in his chair. Maybe it's time we made some changes. Changes? I asked cautiously. Jake's been here long enough, Alan said, his tone casual. I think it's time he moved on, found his own place. My heart sank. Alan, he's still figuring things out. And he can figure them out somewhere else, Alan interrupted, his gaze hard. This isn't up for debate, Lorraine. When I told Jake, his reaction was explosive. He's kicking me out? Jake said, his voice rising. Because of what? A conversation in the garden? He's suspicious, Jake, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He thinks what? Jake snapped. That something's going on? That's his problem, not ours. I placed a hand on his arm, trying to steady him. We knew this was a risk, we can't let this get worse. Jake shook his head, his jaw clenched. He's not doing this because he's suspicious. He's doing this because he wants to control you, and I'm not going to let him. The night Alan told Jake to leave was the beginning of the end. You have a week to pack your things, Alan said over dinner, his tone calm but firm. Jake's fork clattered against his plate as he stood abruptly. You don't get to decide when I leave. This is my house, Alan replied, his voice icy. And I won't tolerate this anymore. Tolerate what? Jake shot back, his voice rising. Me being here, or me getting closer to Lorraine than you ever could? The room fell silent, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Alan's expression darkened, and he stood, his voice low and dangerous. Get out of this house before I make you regret it. That night I found Jake in his room, his suitcase half-packed. You can't let him win, he said, his voice tight with anger. This isn't about winning, I replied, my voice trembling. This is about surviving. He turned to me, his eyes blazing. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to stay with him. I don't have a choice, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. There's always a choice, Jake said, stepping closer. Come with me. His words hung in the air, and for a moment I let myself imagine it, leaving everything behind, starting over somewhere far away. But the reality of what that would mean came crashing down, and I shook my head. I can't, I said, my voice breaking. Jake looked at me for a long moment before nodding. Then I'll go, he said quietly. But this isn't over. The next morning, Jake was gone. Alan didn't speak to me, and I spent the day wandering the empty house, haunted by the silence. But the real shock came that evening, when I found a note slipped under my bedroom door. You think you've won, Alan. But you don't know the truth. I'll make sure you do, Heather. My hands trembled as I read the note, the implications sinking in. Heather knew. She had seen something, overheard something, and now she was using it to her advantage. The note from Heather was like a ticking bomb in my hands. I stood frozen in my bedroom, reading the words over and over until they blurred together. My first instinct was to confront her, to demand to know what she thought she had on me. But the truth was, I already knew. She had seen or heard enough to piece together something dangerous, and now she held all the power. The confrontation came 2 days later. Heather invited herself over again, this time under the pretense of delivering some paperwork for Alan. I cornered her in the kitchen, my voice low and sharp as I held out the note. "What is this?" I demanded, my hands trembling. Heather didn't even flinch. She leaned against the counter, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Exactly what it says. Alan deserves to know the truth, don't you think?" "There's nothing to tell," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. Heather raised an eyebrow, her expression dripping with mock sympathy. "Oh, Lorraine, you don't really believe that, do you? I've seen the way you and Jake look at each other. I'm not blind." My chest tightened, and I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "If you think you can manipulate me with this, you're wrong. I won't let you destroy my family." Heather laughed softly, shaking her head. "Destroy your family? Lorraine, you've already done that. I'm just expediting the inevitable." Before I could respond, the sound of Alan's voice carried down the hallway, and Heather's smile widened. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I'll handle the timing." That evening, Alan was quieter than usual, his mood tense as he picked at his dinner. Heather had left hours earlier, but her presence lingered like a shadow over the house. I couldn't tell if she had said anything to him, but the silence between us was suffocating. Finally, Alan set down his fork and looked at me. "Lorraine, is there something you want to tell me?" My heart stopped. I forced a smile, feigning confusion. "What do you mean?" Alan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You've been acting strange lately. And then there's Heather, dropping hints about things I don't understand. If there's something going on, now's the time to tell me." Panic bubbled in my chest, but I kept my composure. "Alan, there's nothing going on. Heather is just trying to stir up drama. You know how she is." Alan studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I hope you're right," he said, his tone heavy with warning. "Because if I find out otherwise—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Heather's threat loomed over me, and Alan's growing suspicion made every move feel like a step closer to disaster. And then, just as I was drifting off, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, my heart pounding as I read the message. "Meet me tomorrow, noon, the park by the bridge. Jake." The next day, I left the house under the pretense of running errands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I drove to the park, my mind racing with what Jake could possibly want to say. When I arrived, he was waiting by the bridge, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "You shouldn't have contacted me," I said as I approached, my voice trembling. "I didn't have a choice," he replied, his eyes dark with frustration. "Heather came to see me." "What?" I breathed, the ground seeming to shift beneath me. "She knows, Lorraine," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "She knows everything, and she's using it to get to Alan." My stomach churned. "What did she say to you?" "She wanted me to confess."